On November 24th, 1971, a man boarded a plane with a briefcase. He was polite, well dressed, forgettable. He paid in cash, he chose a seat, and he waited. No one on board could have known that within hours this ordinary passenger would commit one of the most audacious crimes in history, and then vanish into the night without ever being found. Welcome back to Closing Crimes. Tonight we follow a story that begins in a calm routine and ends somewhere over the wilderness with a question that has never been answered. The flight was Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a short journey from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. Nothing unusual. Passengers boarded casually, expecting a routine trip the day before Thanksgiving. Among them was a man who gave the name Dan Cooper. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with a dark suit, a white shirt, and a black tie. Everything about him suggested professionalism, the kind of man you would sit next to and forget by the end of the flight. He took his seat near the rear of the plane and ordered a drink, bourbon, and soda. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper handed a folded note to a flight attendant. At first, she just assumed it was a phone number, something she had always seen before, so she just placed it in her pocket without reading it. Then he leaned closer and he spoke quietly to her. Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb. So she opened it. The message was direct. It read, no panic, no theatres, just instructions. Cooper did not shout, he did not threaten wildly, and he did not draw attention. Instead, he controlled the situation with calm. He allowed the flight attendant to sit beside him. He opened his briefcase just enough to show what appeared to be a bomb. Wires and cylinders, convincing enough. Then he made his demand. $200,000 in cash and four parachutes. The plane would land in Seattle, the money would be delivered, and passengers would be released, and the flight would continue. While passengers sat unaware, the cockpit received the message. Authorities were contacted on the ground, and the FBI soon became involved. Air traffic control delayed the landing under the pretense of routine congestion. Time was needed, time to gather the money, and time to prepare. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, Cooper remained composed. He drank, he smoked, and he spoke politely. He even assured the crew everything would be fine if instructions were followed. When the plane finally landed in Seattle, the situation shifted. The aircraft taxied to a remote area of the runway. Engines were still running, and negotiators complied, so the money was delivered and the parachutes were brought aboard. Passengers were released. They walked away from the plane, believing the danger was over, but the real story was just beginning. With only crew remaining, Cooper gave new instructions. The plane would take off again, head south, fly low, and keep speed reduced. This was no longer a negotiation, this was preparation. As the aircraft lifted back into the sky, it carried fewer people, but far more uncertainty. Somewhere between Seattle and Portland, in darkness and bad weather, something happened. The crew noticed a change in cabin pressure, a shift, subtle but real. They had been instructed not to approach him, not to interfere, and so they didn't. And when the plane eventually landed again, he was gone, without a trace, just an open stairway, in the absence of a man who had been there only hours before. A man boarded a plane, committed a crime in complete control, took the money, and stepped out into the night. The question that followed would last for decades. Did he survive? Somewhere over the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the rear stairway of the aircraft lowered into the rushing air. Rain fell heavily. Winds moved unpredictably. Cooper stood alone in the cabin, with the money secured, a parachute on his back. No witnesses close enough to describe his final moments. No camera, no record, only a decision to step out of an aircraft at night into terrain that had even experienced outdoorsmen would hesitate to cross in daylight. And then he was gone. As soon as the plane landed, his absence was confirmed. The scale of the situation became clear. This was no longer a hijacking, it was a disappearance. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in American history. Search team moved into the forests of Washington. Helicopters scanned the terrain. Ground crews combed through miles of wilderness. They searched for a parachute, a body, the money, anything. But the landscape offered nothing. No footprints, no sign of a landing. It was as if the night had swallowed him whole. The more investigators examined the conditions of the jump, the more improbable survival seemed. The weather was poor, cold rain and strong winds, and the terrain below was unforgiving, almost unsurvivable. Rivers, rough ground, and a dense forest. He had jumped wearing business shoes, a suit with limited visibility. Many experts believed no one could survive such a descent unprepared, but no body was found. Years passed. The case grew quieter. Then, in 1980, nearly a decade later, something changed. A young boy digging near the Columbia River discovered a bundle of cash, withered and decaying, but identifiable. The serial numbers matched the ransom money. It was the first real physical evidence since the night of the hijacking. But instead of answering questions, it just created more. How had the money reached the riverbank? Had Cooper survived only to lose it later? Or had the elements carried it there over time? As the years went on, theories multiplied. Some believed Cooper was highly trained, a former military parachutist, someone who understood flight patterns and terrain. Others believed the opposite, that the jump was desperate and reckless, ultimately fatal. There were ideas of accomplices waiting on the ground, carefully planned escape routes, but each theory required evidence, and evidence remained frustratingly thin. Over time, the FBI examined hundreds of possible suspects, men with military backgrounds, men with aviation knowledge, men who disappeared shortly after 1971, and each brought attention, but some seemed convincing until they weren't. Alibis appeared, details didn't match, and DNA failed to confirm. One by one, suspects were considered and then dismissed, so they came to the conclusion that this case became less about finding the right person and more about eliminating the wrong ones. What made Cooper different from other criminals was not just what he did, but how he did it. He was calm and controlled. He was deliberate. He did not harm a single passenger, and he did not panic once. He executed his plan with quiet confidence, which left investigators with a disturbing question. Was this his first time? Or simply the first time he had been noticed? Years became decades. The world changed, technology advanced, and new cases emerged. But the story of Dan Cooper remained. It became something more than a crime. It became a legend, a man who had challenged the system and possibly beating it. There are two ways to understand this story. The first is simple. He jumped, he fell into the wilderness, and he did not survive. The second is harder to accept. He planned carefully, he landed successfully, and he disappeared. And he lived the rest of his life in quiet anonymity, perhaps passing people on the street who had no idea who he was. In 2016, after decades of investigation, the FBI officially suspended active pursuit of the case. Not solved, not forgotten, but no longer actively chased. The file remains open, but the trial has grown cold. Imagine the final moment, the door open, the wind loud, the earth invisible below. A man standing between everything he knows and everything unknown, and then stepping forward. No witnesses, no certainty, only the night. This has been Closing Crimes, because sometimes the most unsettling stories are not the ones we don't understand, but the ones that simply end without an answer.